Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. Say hello to the sharks, my daughter-in-law whispered as she shoved me off the yacht. My son Andrew simply stood there smiling. Their intention was clear. They wanted my $3 billion fortune. But when they returned home later that same evening, I was already sitting in my favorite armchair, waiting for them with a very special surprise. If you are watching this, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Let me rewind and explain how an ordinary Tuesday morning ended with me plunging into the Atlantic Ocean. I probably should have noticed the warning signs. Still, at 67 years old, I believed family meant something. I believed blood was thicker than seawater, for lack of a better phrase. The day had started pleasantly enough. Andrew called me himself, not through his assistant, which in hindsight should have been my first clue. He invited me on what he described as a celebratory cruise aboard his new yacht. He told me they wanted to raise a glass to my recovery from surgery, explaining that it would just be the three of us like a proper family. I had been recovering from a hip replacement for 6 weeks. Truthfully, I was clinging to any sign that my son and his wife, Lauren, still wanted me in their lives after my husband James passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me his technology empire fortune. Things between us had felt distant and strained. So that morning, I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the one James always said made my eyes stand out, and took a taxi to the marina. The yacht was stunning, a gleaming white vessel that likely cost more than most houses. Andrew greeted me at the dock with an embrace that felt rehearsed, while Lauren observed from the deck, her smile sharp and brittle. Andrew gestured proudly toward the boat and talked about how beautiful it was, mentioning that it measured 42 feet of pure luxury. He spoke excitedly about taking it to the Caribbean the following month. What he failed to mention was that the yacht had been purchased with the $3 million I had given them the previous year to invest in Andrew's consulting business, money I was starting to suspect had never gone anywhere near a real company. The first hour passed pleasantly. We cruised through calm water as the Massachusetts coastline slowly faded behind us. Lauren poured mimosas and chatted about plans to renovate the house, my former house, which I had signed over to them after James died because I thought moving to a condo would be easier. Then Andrew began asking questions. At first they sounded casual, inquiries about my will, the trust, and whether I had thought about simplifying things for them. He mentioned that probate could be complicated and kept refilling my champagne glass with a little too much enthusiasm, saying they just wanted everything handled properly. That was when I noticed Lauren holding her phone at an angle. She was pretending to take selfies, but she was clearly recording me while I drank and talked about financial matters. Suddenly, everything fell into place. My surgery. Their insistence on managing my paperwork afterward. The power of attorney forms they brought to the hospital, claiming they were temporary, just to help while I recovered. Even my financial advisor had stopped returning my calls. I carefully set my glass down and told Andrew that I wanted to return to shore. That was the moment his expression changed completely. He explained that was not going to happen. His voice was harder now as he said they needed to talk about my health and supposed memory problems. Lauren stepped closer and claimed they had documented signs of dementia. She said doctors agreed I was no longer capable of handling my finances. I said it was absurd, but even as I spoke I realized how thoroughly this had been planned. We were miles from shore. No other boats were nearby. Just the three of us, open water, and their scheme to force me to sign everything over. Andrew said they were only trying to help, but his eyes were cold. He explained that we could handle things easily or make it difficult. I stood slowly, my hips still sore but my mind perfectly clear, and asked what would happen if I refused. That was when Lauren truly smiled for the first time that day. She calmly described how an elderly woman recovering from surgery could become disoriented after taking pain medication. She shrugged and reminded me that tragic accidents happened all the time. I had raised this man from infancy. I taught him how to ride a bicycle. I paid for his education, his wedding, his home. Now he stood there silently while his wife threatened my life. Andrew produced a folder and explained that all I needed to do was sign the papers transferring my assets to them for my own protection. Then we could all go home content. I looked at the documents, at my son's expectant face, and at Lauren's phone still recording. Then I looked out at the ocean, vast and unforgiving, yet somehow less terrifying than the two people who were supposed to love me. I told them exactly where they could go. Lauren stepped behind me and quietly repeated her comment about sharks. The shove was subtle, calculated. I was off balance, staring at the water, and then I was falling. Navy dress and all, I plunged into the freezing Atlantic. As I hit the surface, I heard Andrew shouting my name in panic, even as the water closed over me. But I also heard Lauren lower her voice as she spoke to someone on the phone. She said they would need an emergency petition filed first thing Monday morning, and added that I was clearly not competent anymore. Then the water closed over my head, and suddenly their betrayal became secondary to survival. I am a strong swimmer. James and I used to swim laps together every morning. Still, the shock of the cold hit my system hard, and my clothes began pulling me downward. I kicked off my shoes and forced myself back to the surface, gasping for air, just in time to see the yacht racing away from me. They were actually abandoning me out there to die. That was when I saw the fishing boat. Captain Peter Caldwell was exactly the kind of man who would jump into shark-infested waters to save a drowning grandmother. He was in his early 60s, weathered by decades at sea, and carried the kind of moral compass that was clearly missing from my own family. He shouted in shock as he and his teenage grandson hauled me onto their fishing vessel, demanding to know what had happened. I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so violently that I could barely form words. Peter wrapped me in a blanket that smelled of salt and motor oil while his grandson, Lucas, started the engine. Between shivers, I managed to say that it was my family who had done this to me. Peter spoke grimly, saying they had seen the yacht take off like a bat out of hell and never once looked back. He asked what kind of people would leave someone floating alone in the middle of the ocean. I thought to myself that they were the kind who would inherit $3 billion if I was no longer around, but aloud I simply said they were not really family. Peter radioed the Coast Guard while Lucas wrapped another blanket around me. He reported that they had pulled a woman from the water roughly 12 miles southeast of Gloucester, and that I was conscious but needed medical attention. I grabbed his arm and begged him not to let anyone know they had found me, at least not yet. Peter studied my face with the sharp, experienced gaze of someone who understood when a person was fleeing more than cold water. He asked if I was in serious trouble. I told him yes, but not in the way he might be thinking. Taking a shaky breath, I explained that I needed to reach shore without anyone knowing I had survived and asked if he could help me. Lucas looked uncertainly at his grandfather and asked whether that was the right thing to do. Peter answered slowly that right and wrong were not always clear, and that sometimes doing the right thing did not look like following the rules. He keyed the radio again and told the Coast Guard it had been a false alarm, saying the report turned out to be debris in the water and everything was clear. As we headed toward a small private dock, Peter asked questions and I told him everything. I explained what Andrew and Lauren had done, the money, the documents, and the plan to take control of my life. Peter listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he remarked that they had decided they would rather be wealthy orphans than struggling children with a living mother. Then he asked what I planned to do next. That was the question. As far as Andrew and Lauren knew, I was dead. They would return to shore, call the authorities, report me missing overboard, and play the role of grieving family while executing whatever legal documents they had prepared. But there is something powerful about being presumed dead. It gives you options you never have when you are alive. I told Peter that I was going to let them believe they had won, and then I was going to destroy them. My own calm surprised me. Peter grinned for the first time since pulling me from the water, and said that sounded like a plan worth helping with. Lucas dropped us at a tiny dock in a cove I had never seen before. Peter knew a woman there who ran a small bed and breakfast. She asked no questions and accepted only cash. Mrs. Liu, a tough-looking woman in her 70s, took one look at my soaked, exhausted state and immediately began heating soup. She did not even blink when Peter explained that I needed a place to stay quietly for a while. She told me she had been running that place for 30 years as she ladled chicken broth into a bowl. She said she had seen people running from all kinds of situations, and as long as I was not bringing violence to her door, I was welcome to stay. That evening, while Andrew and Lauren were presumably filing police reports about their tragically missing mother, I sat in Mrs. Liu's kitchen wearing borrowed clothes and quietly planning their downfall. Peter had agreed to act as my eyes and ears. His boat was legitimately used for fishing charters, which meant he spent a lot of time around the marina where Andrew kept the yacht. He could watch their movements, overhear conversations, and possibly investigate on his own. I told Peter that there was something I could not understand as I sipped my third cup of coffee. I asked how they had planned to make this legal, because even if I died accidentally, there would still be procedures and investigations. Peter agreed and said that was what had been bothering him as well. He said they must have had more than forged paperwork and likely someone on the inside helping them. That night, I made a list of everyone who had access to my financial information since James died. My lawyer, my accountant, my financial advisor, the bank managers, and the trust officers all went on the list. Someone had been feeding Andrew and Lauren information and helping them plan this, and I was determined to find out who. Before anything else, I needed to know exactly what story they were telling about my disappearance. Mrs. Liu had an old computer with internet access, and I spent hours reading news reports about the tragic boating accident that had supposedly claimed the life of James Whitman's widow. The articles described a grieving family coping with an elderly woman's declining mental state. Andrew was quoted at length, talking about my confusion and memory problems in recent months. Lauren was described as sobbing to reporters about how worried they had been about my safety. They had even included a photograph. It was a picture of me at Andrew's birthday party the previous year, holding a drink and looking slightly bewildered. I remembered that moment clearly. I had been confused because no one told me it was a surprise party. I had arrived expecting a quiet family dinner, and instead found 20 strangers in my former home. But in the photograph, I simply looked lost and elderly. It was exactly the image they wanted to present. My obituary was already online. It described me as a beloved mother and grandmother who had passed away in a tragic boating accident while enjoying time with her devoted family. In lieu of flowers, donations were requested for the Alzheimer's Association. Even in death, they were continuing the narrative of my supposed mental decline. I muttered an insult as I closed the laptop. Mrs. Liu glanced up from her knitting and asked if I was planning something special for them. I told her yes, something very special indeed. The funeral was surprisingly well attended for someone who was supposedly dying of dementia. I watched from across the cemetery through binoculars Peter had borrowed from his fishing gear, hidden behind a maintenance shed that gave me a clear view of the service. Andrew had spared no expense. There was a premium casket, empty of course, elaborate flower arrangements, and a professionally printed program with my photo on the front. He and Lauren stood at the graveside dressed in perfectly coordinated black, accepting condolences from friends, business associates, and people I barely recognized. What struck me most was how genuinely sad many of the mourners looked. My neighbor Eleanor was crying openly. My book club friends were there. Even Dr. Adams, who had handled my hip surgery, attended and looked somber. These people truly cared about me, and Andrew and Lauren accepted their sympathy while knowing I was still alive. Peter whispered and asked if I saw anything interesting. I told him that aside from my son giving an award-worthy performance, he should look at who was missing. Peter adjusted his binoculars and asked who I meant. I pointed out my financial advisor Stephen Miller, my lawyer Linda Monroe, and my accountant Daniel Sloan. As I lowered the binoculars, the pieces began to fit together. The people who would normally attend the funeral of a client worth $3 billion were nowhere to be seen. Maybe they were busy handling the estate. Or maybe they could not bring themselves to look anyone in the eye while being part of this scheme. After the service, I watched Andrew and Lauren work their way through the crowd like politicians, shaking hands, accepting hugs, and playing their roles flawlessly. I also noticed how quickly they redirected anyone who began asking specific questions about my final hours. That afternoon, Peter drove me back to Mrs. Liu's house in his pickup, deliberately taking a winding route to avoid being seen. By then, I had officially been dead for 4 days, and I was beginning to understand just how much leverage that gave me. As we pulled into Mrs. Liu's driveway, I told Peter that I needed to get into my old house. He said it sounded dangerous and assumed Andrew and Lauren were probably staying there. I told him they were not. According to the property records I had checked that morning, they were still living at their own place. My house had been empty since I moved into the condo the year before. I showed him a sheet of paper where I had been writing notes. I told him the strange part was that someone had been paying the utilities. Electricity, water, heating, all of it. The house was being maintained. I asked why anyone would do that if no one was living there. Peter agreed it did not make sense. I told him that was exactly why I needed to see it for myself. That night, Peter dropped me off 3 blocks away from my former home in Beacon Hill. It was the house where James and I had lived for 35 years, where I raised Andrew, hosted countless dinner parties and holidays, and the house I had signed over to my son because I believed family still meant something. It was well past midnight, and the street was quiet except for an occasional car driving by. I still had my key. Andrew had never bothered to ask for it back. I went around to the back door and slipped inside, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. The house felt wrong. Not abandoned, but altered in a way I could not immediately explain. Using the flashlight Peter had given me, I moved carefully through rooms I knew by heart, avoiding the windows that faced the street. The living room furniture was covered with sheets, but I could tell new items had been added. Expensive items. A leather sofa that cost more than most cars. A massive entertainment system that had never been there before. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was filled, not with basic supplies, but with fresh and costly food. Imported cheeses, organic produce, the kind of groceries bought by someone who expected to be there often. But it was the home office, James's old study, that revealed everything. The desk was buried under paperwork, legal documents, financial statements, and at the center of it all, a detailed timeline labeled the Claire Project. Seeing my own name reduced to a project title made my stomach turn. I photographed every page with the disposable camera Peter had given me, my hands trembling as I read. They had been planning this for more than a year. Every so-called sign of my mental decline had been carefully staged and recorded. Doctor visits where they nudged me to appear confused. Social situations engineered to make me look disoriented. The birthday party photo that ended up in the paper. They had intentionally kept me in the dark so they could capture my reaction. The medication mix-up from 3 months earlier that sent me to the emergency room had not been an accident. They had switched my prescription bottles. Every moment I had seemed forgetful or unsteady had been manufactured and preserved as proof of dementia. The most disturbing document was a letter signed only with the initials MT, clearly written by someone deeply involved. It said the timeline needed to be sped up. It noted that Claire was asking too many questions about the power of attorney. It warned that if I went to a lawyer on my own, the entire plan would collapse. The recommendation was to move to Phase 3 within the next 2 weeks. Phase 3 was my death. I was photographing the final page when I heard a car door slam outside. Headlights swept across the front windows, and voices approached the front door. Andrew and Lauren were home, returning from their performance as grieving family members. I gathered my things quickly and moved toward the back door, but I could still hear them talking as they came inside. Andrew asked whether the Adams woman had believed it. Lauren replied that she had been crying too hard to think clearly. They were saying there was nothing to investigate anyway. A woman fell off a boat, and it happened all the time. Andrew asked how long it would take before probate officially opened on Monday. Lauren replied that MT had assured them full access to the accounts would come within 6 weeks. I slipped quietly out through the back door and into the garden, my pulse racing. As I moved along the side of the house toward the street, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A baby was crying. There was an infant inside my former home. Andrew and Lauren had never once mentioned having a child, and in that instant I knew there was far more happening than I had understood. That single sound changed everything. Crouched behind the rose bushes I had planted 20 years earlier, listening to a baby cry inside a house that used to be mine, I realized this was no longer just about money. Something much larger was unfolding. Peter picked me up at the corner about 15 minutes later. I was still trembling as I climbed into his truck. He said I looked like I had seen a ghost. I told him it was worse than that. I told him I had seen my replacement. I explained everything. The baby. The documents. The name MT that appeared to be directing the entire operation. Peter repeated the word baby slowly, clearly stunned. He said Andrew and Lauren had never mentioned a child, not once. He reminded me how Andrew had always claimed they were not ready for children because their careers came first. I pulled the disposable camera from my pocket and said the photos needed to be developed somewhere safe. Not anywhere they might have influence. Peter said he knew someone in Gloucester who ran a 1-hour Photoshop and did not ask questions. While we waited for the pictures, we sat in his truck with gas station coffee, going over my notes. Peter said it was clear they had been working on this for over a year, carefully building a record that made me look incapable, documenting everything, and securing help from someone inside my financial circle. Then there was the baby, which meant either they had been lying about having a child, or something else was going on. Another thought occurred to me. I said it was possible the baby was not actually theirs. Peter asked what I meant. I told him to think it through. If they were planning to steal my fortune, they would want a clear heir in place. Someone with a legal claim to inherit everything if something happened to them. That would require a child with the right paperwork and the right lineage. Peter looked at me carefully and asked if I thought they had stolen a baby. I said I did not know exactly what they had done, but I was certain they had done something. And I was convinced that MT was the key to understanding all of it. When the photos were developed, they were devastating. The images showed undeniable proof of a long-term conspiracy. Timelines, fabricated medical records, financial projections outlining how they intended to spend my money. But the most disturbing image was the last one. It was a birth certificate I had nearly missed, hidden beneath other papers. It listed a baby with the Whitman name, born 3 weeks earlier. The parents were listed as Lauren Whitman and Andrew Whitman. I told Peter the document was fake. I had been with Lauren 4 days earlier on the yacht, and she showed no signs of having recently given birth. Peter asked whose baby it was then. That night sleep never came. I lay awake in Mrs. Liu's guest room, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything in my mind. My son and daughter-in-law had spent more than a year destroying my reputation, planning my death, and forging documents to take my fortune. And now there was a baby they were hiding from the world. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Over breakfast, I told Peter I was going back. Not to the house, but to follow them. Peter said it was extremely dangerous and reminded me that if they saw me, it would be over. I told him they would not see me, because as far as they knew, I was already dead. I spread a local map across Mrs. Liu's kitchen table and pointed things out. I said they had to take the baby somewhere during the day. A sitter, a nurse, something. Babies did not simply vanish for 8 hours while their parents played the role of grieving family. Peter studied the map and asked what I hoped to find. I told him I needed the truth about the baby, and if possible, the identity of MT. Mrs. Liu, who had been quietly listening while washing dishes, finally spoke up. She said she knew a private investigator in town who owed her a favor. She described him as discreet, professional, and very good at following people without being noticed. I protested that I could not involve anyone else. Mrs. Liu dried her hands and told me gently that I was far past handling this alone. She reminded me that these people had already tried to kill me, and would not hesitate to try again if they learned I was alive. She was right, but hiring a private investigator meant letting more people know my secret. It meant widening the circle of those who knew I was not actually dead. I asked what kind of favor this investigator owed her. She smiled and said it involved her grandson not going to jail for something foolish he had done at the age of 22. The investigator's name was Daniel Reeves. He was a former police officer, dependable, and very good at making problems disappear. By noon, I was sitting in Daniel Reeves's office above a sandwich shop in downtown Gloucester, telling my story for the 3rd time in a week. Daniel was around 50 years old, with prematurely gray hair and sharp, observant eyes. After I finished, he summarized the situation clearly. He said I wanted him to follow my son and daughter-in-law, learn the truth about the baby, and identify whoever was helping them. I told him that was correct. He asked how I intended to pay, given that the newspapers were reporting all my assets frozen pending probate. I handed him an envelope filled with cash. I explained that I had emergency funds hidden in a safety deposit box Andrew did not know about. James had always insisted on keeping liquid money available. Daniel counted the bills, enough for 2 weeks of surveillance, and nodded. He said he would need photographs of the people involved and any addresses where they might be going. I handed Daniel everything I had collected, including the photographs from my nighttime entry into the house. He examined them slowly, lingering over the documents marked with the unfamiliar MT signature. He studied the handwriting closely, then took out a magnifying glass. He said the writing looked professional, deliberate, and familiar, but it also carried a few distinctive traits that stood out. He asked whether I would mind if he ran the handwriting through several databases. I told him to do whatever was necessary. Before I left his office, Daniel added one more condition. He said that if these people were as dangerous as I believed, we needed safeguards. He explained that I would check in with him every 12 hours. If I failed to do so, he would immediately take everything to the police. I agreed, even though I hoped it would never reach that point. For now, the less official involvement, the better. At least until I fully understood what Andrew and Lauren had already set into motion. That afternoon, I returned to Mrs. Liu's house and waited. I planned. For the first time since the yacht, I was not alone. I had real help, professional help. And within less than 24 hours, I would finally know who had tried to kill me and why. Daniel Reeves proved to be worth every cent I had paid him. By the end of the second day, he had uncovered more about Andrew and Lauren's movements than I had learned in months of living under the same roof with them. He laid a series of photographs across Mrs. Liu's kitchen table and explained that my son had been extremely busy since my supposed death. He pointed out multiple meetings with lawyers, 2 separate visits to the bank, and 3 trips to a private medical facility outside Boston. That facility, he explained, was Whitmore Reproductive Services. It was discreet, exclusive, and extraordinarily expensive. He showed us a photograph of Andrew and Lauren entering a sleek glass building, and said the clinic specialized in surrogacy arrangements for wealthy clients who valued secrecy above all else. The realization made my stomach turn. They had bought a baby. Daniel confirmed that it was not just any child. They had specifically requested a newborn who could convincingly pass as their biological son. According to his contact inside Whitmore, the arrangements had been made 8 months earlier, paid entirely in cash, with explicit instructions for a pre-prepared birth certificate. Mrs. Liu quietly set 3 cups of coffee on the table and sat down with us. She summarized it plainly. They had planned my death, purchased a baby to inherit my fortune, and enlisted help from someone inside my financial circle. Daniel said that was where things became even more interesting. He pulled out another photograph and said he believed he had identified MT. The image showed a woman in her 40s, with short auburn hair and a costly briefcase, shaking hands with Andrew outside a downtown law office. She looked vaguely familiar, though I could not immediately place her. Daniel said her name was Victoria Sloan. She was a partner at Caldwell Sloan & Associates, a firm that handled estate planning for several high-profile Boston families. The surname hit me hard. I asked whether she was related to Daniel Sloan, my accountant. Daniel said they were married. That was when everything clicked. He explained that Victoria Sloan had been quietly cultivating a client base of wealthy elderly individuals who had strained or fractured family relationships. She marketed her services under the name Family Transition Planning. I finally remembered where I had met her. It had been about 6 months earlier at a charity event Andrew insisted I attend. She had shown an unusual level of interest in my estate plans and asked very specific questions about my trust structures. Daniel said that made perfect sense because Victoria Sloan followed a very deliberate business model. She identified elderly clients with significant assets and opportunistic families. She then helped those families accelerate their inheritance through what she described as compassionate intervention. Mrs. Liu cut in bluntly and said that sounded like murder. Daniel clarified that Victoria created legal frameworks that allowed families to seize control of assets while the elderly person was still alive. She relied on claims of incompetence, dementia, or diminished capacity to justify the transfers. He said she had done this at least 6 times in the past 3 years. Daniel spread out additional photographs. Surveillance images showed Victoria meeting with different families, entering law offices, and visiting private medical facilities. He explained that she ran a full operation. She identified vulnerable seniors, coordinated manufactured evidence of mental decline, provided legal cover for asset transfers, and collected a significant portion of the inheritance. When an elderly person refused to cooperate or became suspicious, accidents followed. Boating incidents, staircase falls, medication overdoses. Always tragic. Always plausible. Always profitable. I felt physically ill. This was no longer just about my money. It was a system designed to prey on vulnerable older people. I asked how many people she had killed. Daniel said he could not prove any in court yet, but he suspected at least 12 deaths over the past 5 years. He explained that she only worked with families who could offer believable alternative explanations for those deaths. I said we had to stop her. Daniel agreed, but he said the first step was understanding exactly what Andrew and Lauren had already filed. According to his sources, they had submitted preliminary probate documents the day before. He opened a legal folder and explained that they were claiming I had died without a valid will, which would make them my sole heirs. They were also asserting that any prior estate documents were invalid, because they had allegedly been signed while I was mentally incompetent. I told him that I had a will. Not a vague outline or an old draft, but a precise, carefully structured document that had been updated 2 years earlier. Daniel nodded and said he knew. He opened the folder in front of him and pulled out a document I recognized instantly. It was my will, complete with what looked like my signature at the bottom. But as I read it, my stomach dropped. The language was wrong. The clauses were unfamiliar. Entire sections had been rewritten. This was not the document I had signed. They replaced it, I said quietly, scanning the forged pages again just to be sure. The altered will left everything to Andrew, with provisions for any future children he might have, including the baby they had recently obtained through Whitmore Reproductive Services. I stood and walked to the window in Mrs. Liu's kitchen, staring out toward the ocean. Only a week earlier, I had been a grieving widow trying to preserve some kind of relationship with my only remaining family. Now I was a failed murder victim who had survived her own attempted assassination, and discovered that her son was part of a criminal enterprise designed to exploit and eliminate elderly people. Daniel spoke again, his voice careful. He said there was something else I needed to know. I turned back to him immediately. He said it concerned the baby. The birth mother was a 17-year-old girl named Emily Hart. She had run away from Maine. She had no family and no support system. Victoria Sloan had found her at a shelter in Portland and offered her $50,000 to carry a child for a wealthy couple who claimed they could not conceive. I asked where Emily was now. Daniel's expression hardened. According to the medical records, she died from complications during delivery. But he had spoken directly with a nurse at Whitmore who remembered her clearly. The nurse said Emily had been healthy, with no risk factors, and had a completely normal pregnancy right up until the day she gave birth. The silence that followed felt heavy. They killed her, I said. Daniel replied that he believed so, though he could not yet prove it. What he could prove was that my son and daughter-in-law were involved in an organization that had been systematically murdering elderly people for their money. He added that the next morning, Andrew and Lauren were scheduled to meet with Victoria Sloan to finalize the legal transfer of my assets. I sat down again, my thoughts racing. I asked where the meeting would take place. Daniel said it would be at Sloan's office downtown, scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. I looked at Mrs. Liu, then at Daniel, then at the photographs spread across the table, one of which showed my son smiling as he shook hands with a professional killer. Then I said that it was time for Claire Whitman to come back from the dead. The most difficult part of planning a resurrection, I quickly realized, was deciding who should experience the shock first. I could confront Andrew and Lauren privately, which would give them the opportunity to explain themselves. But that assumed they deserved an explanation. I could also make my return public, allowing them to learn I was alive the same way everyone else would. Instead, I chose a third approach: strategic haunting. When I explained it, Daniel asked me to clarify what I meant. I said that I wanted them to know I was alive, but not understand how much I knew about their operation. I wanted them unsettled, distracted, and making mistakes. Mrs. Liu nodded with clear approval and said that psychological warfare had its merits. The plan itself was straightforward. While Andrew, Lauren, and Victoria Sloan were downtown dividing my assets, I would reintroduce myself into their world quietly and deliberately. Daniel had discovered that during the day, the baby was kept at Andrew's house with a private nurse hired through one of Victoria Sloan's front companies. The nurse's name was Rachel Adams. She had no idea the child in her care had been acquired through an illegal arrangement that resulted in the death of a teenage girl. Daniel assured me that Rachel was a good person. She was a single mother, held a nursing degree, and had a clean background. She believed she was providing childcare for a legitimate family. I said that meant she deserved the truth. That morning, while Andrew and Lauren were downtown legally erasing me from existence, I stood on the front porch of my former home and rang the doorbell. Rachel Adams was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with tired eyes and a kind expression. She opened the door holding a baby bottle and wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon animals. She asked how she could help. I introduced myself by name and told her I believed she was caring for my grandson. The color drained from her face. She recognized the name immediately. It had been everywhere for the past week. She said she thought I was dead. I replied that I had read the articles as well. I said they were fascinating, though not entirely accurate. I smiled and asked if I could come inside, explaining that we needed to talk. She stepped aside slowly, still staring at me as though I might vanish. Inside the living room, my former living room, a baby sat in a bouncy seat, making soft, contented sounds. When I saw him, my breath caught. He was perfect. About 3 weeks old, with dark hair and thoughtful brown eyes. He wore an expensive outfit, and the room around him was filled with high-end baby equipment that must have cost a small fortune. I asked what his name was as I sat beside him. Rachel said that they referred to him as Baby Whitman. She hesitated, then added that Andrew and Lauren had mentioned possibly naming him James Jr. after his grandfather, but they had not finalized anything. I said softly that they had not decided because they did not know him well enough to name him. I added that the reason was simple. He was not really their child. Rachel sank onto the sofa, visibly shaken. Rachel shook her head slowly, clearly overwhelmed. She said she did not understand what was happening. According to everything she had been told, I was supposed to be dead. Andrew and Lauren were supposed to be grieving parents who only needed help caring for their newborn, while they handled family matters. I told her to listen carefully and not interrupt me until I finished. I explained that the baby was not Andrew and Lauren's biological child. I told her they had obtained him through an illegal surrogacy arrangement that resulted in the death of the birth mother. I added that 6 days earlier, they had tried to murder me so they could steal my inheritance and raise the child as their legal heir. Rachel whispered that it could not be true. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photographs Daniel had taken, along with the documents I had copied from Andrew's home office. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, including records that showed Victoria Sloane's involvement. As Rachel read and looked through everything, disbelief gave way to shock, and then to horror. I told her gently that the young woman who gave birth to the baby was named Emily Hart. She was 17 years old with no family and no support system. She had been told she was helping a loving couple who could not have children. She died during delivery under circumstances that raised serious questions. Rachel began to cry. She looked at the baby again, this time with an entirely different expression. She said that meant the child was an orphan. I confirmed that he was. I added that if Andrew and Lauren succeeded, he would grow up believing they were his parents and never know that his real mother had died to give him life. Rachel asked what I wanted her to do. I told her I needed her to document everything. I asked her to take photographs, keep records of how they treated the baby, write down what they told her, and note anyone else who came into contact with him. I also told her that I wanted her help ensuring that the child would one day know the truth about where he came from. She wiped her eyes and agreed. I said that his real name should be James Emily Whitman, after his grandfather and his birth mother. Rachel said it was perfect. I spent the next hour with Rachel and baby James Emily, taking photographs, recording details about the house, and explaining what would happen next. She agreed to continue caring for him while quietly gathering evidence and keeping me informed about Andrew and Lauren's movements. As I prepared to leave, Rachel told me they usually returned home around noon to check on the baby, make phone calls, and handle business. I said that timing worked perfectly, because by then they would have received my first message. While I had been inside the house, Daniel had been downtown. He had parked across from Victoria Sloane's office building with a telephoto lens, documenting Andrew and Lauren as they entered, met with Sloane, and shook hands over what they believed was my finalized death paperwork. The real surprise, however, was what Peter delivered to their lawyer's office during that meeting. I had written a short note on elegant stationery. It said that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated, that we needed to talk, and that it was signed with love. I added a postscript sending my regards to little James Emily and calling him beautiful. The note was delivered by messenger at exactly 11:47 in the morning. According to Daniel, who was watching from across the street, all three of them came rushing out of the building within minutes of reading it, their faces drained of color and their composure completely gone. That was the moment the psychological warfare truly began. Later that afternoon, when they returned to my former house expecting their plan to remain intact, they were going to learn just how active their supposedly dead victim had been. I was not only alive. I was furious. I was surrounded by evidence and I was prepared for a fight. I positioned myself in my favorite armchair, the one James had given me for our 20th anniversary, making sure I would be the first thing they saw when they walked through the front door of what had once been my home. The expressions on their faces were worth every moment I had spent in the Atlantic Ocean. I greeted them pleasantly without standing, and asked how their meeting had gone. I added that I hoped they had not signed anything important while I was away. Lauren screamed, a raw sound of pure terror, as though she were staring at a nightmare made real. Andrew froze in the doorway, keys still in his hand, staring at me as if blinking might make me disappear. I asked whether they were surprised. I commented that the reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated and mentioned that I had enjoyed reading my own obituary. I also noted that the Alzheimer's donation request had been a particularly creative touch. At that moment, Rachel stepped into the room carrying baby James Emily. She had been waiting in the back of the house, just as we planned. She said that Mrs. Whitman had asked her to bring out the baby so she could meet her grandson properly. Lauren managed to speak, though her voice sounded strained and hoarse. She said that Rachel was mistaken and insisted that I was dead. I clarified that we had already covered that misunderstanding. I added that drowning was more difficult than it looked, especially when there were decent people willing to pull someone out of the water. I took the baby into my arms and felt his warmth settle against me, knowing that everything from this moment forward was going to change. Andrew finally found his voice. He said that they thought the Coast Guard had searched for me. I replied that the Coast Guard had searched for debris, not survivors, and that it was remarkable how that distinction mattered when no one ever reported a person overboard. I took the baby from Rachel and adjusted him carefully in my arms, making sure he was comfortable. I greeted him softly, telling him he was James Emily and that I was his real grandmother, not the kind who tried to purchase children with blood money. Lauren snapped back sharply, some of her composure returning. She said the baby's name was not James Emily and insisted that his name would be whatever they chose, because he was their son. I looked down at the baby, who was staring back at me with calm, serious eyes, then raised my gaze to her. I asked Lauren to explain exactly when she had given birth. I reminded her that 4 days earlier on that yacht, she certainly had not looked like a woman who had delivered a child 3 weeks before. She stammered and said the birth had been private. I replied that it must have been very private indeed, private enough that the real mother had died during delivery under highly suspicious circumstances. I asked them whether they knew her name was Emily Hart, a 17-year-old girl from Maine with no family left to ask questions when she disappeared. The room fell silent. Rachel gasped and covered her mouth. Andrew said it was impossible, but his voice lacked any real certainty. I asked him what exactly was impossible. I asked whether it was impossible that they conspired with Victoria Sloan to run an illegal surrogacy operation, or impossible that they systematically destroyed an elderly woman's reputation to steal her fortune, or impossible that they pushed their own mother off a yacht and left her to die. I stood slowly, still holding the baby, and asked Andrew which part he claimed he would never do. Lauren recovered first. Her shock hardened into the same calculating expression I had seen on the yacht. She told me to prove it, saying that accusations were meaningless without evidence. I smiled for the first time since they walked in and told her she should not have said that. I asked Rachel to take James Emily to his room for his nap, explaining that the adults needed to have a private conversation. Rachel hesitated, then nodded and left the room with the baby. Once they were gone, I walked to the mantel where Andrew had arranged family photographs. None of them included me, which I noted silently. I told both of them to sit down. My voice carried the same authority that once ran James's household without question. They obeyed, still stunned. I told them I would explain what I had been doing for the past week, while they had been planning my funeral and dividing my assets. I pulled a manila folder from behind the chair cushion and opened it. I explained that I had been investigating, documenting, and learning. I spread the photographs Daniel had taken across the table. Images of Andrew and Lauren meeting with Victoria Sloan. Records of repeated visits to Whitmore Reproductive Services. Financial documents showing cash payments for the baby. I pointed to one photograph and identified Victoria Sloan, explaining that she specialized in what she called compassionate intervention, which in plain language meant helping greedy relatives murder elderly people for money. Lauren called it ridiculous, but she could not stop staring at the photographs. I explained that I had documentation of at least 6 other cases where Victoria Sloan provided legal cover for families who wanted their elderly relatives dead. In each case, the victim showed sudden mental decline that was later proven to be manufactured, followed by a convenient accident. I showed them another file and described how Margaret Monroe, age 73, fell down the stairs in her own home 3 weeks after her son began adding sedatives to her evening tea. He inherited $2 million. Andrew had gone pale. I then described Thomas Reed, age 68, who died in a single-car accident after his daughter convinced his doctor to adjust his medication. She inherited $4 million. I looked directly at Andrew and told him these were not theories. They were murders and he was part of the same system. Lauren quickly said they had never killed anyone, adding that even if Victoria Sloan was guilty, they had not personally hurt anyone. I asked them about Emily Hart. No one answered. I asked again about the 17-year-old girl whose baby they bought, the girl who died during delivery, the girl whose death gave them the cover they needed to justify inheriting my fortune. Andrew started to say they did not know, then stopped. I asked whether they did not know that Victoria Sloan was running a black market surrogacy operation using vulnerable teenage girls, or whether they did not know that those girls had a disturbing tendency to die during childbirth, or whether they did not know that this made them accessories to murder. I pulled out another document, Emily Hart's death certificate, which Daniel had obtained through his contacts. It stated that she died from what the medical examiner described as unexpected cardiac arrest during delivery. I held it up so they could both see it clearly, knowing that this was only the beginning of what they were about to face. According to the nurse who was present, Emily had been healthy, young, and showing no signs of distress right up until the moment she suddenly stopped breathing. As I said this, I noticed Rachel standing silently in the doorway, having returned without my noticing, listening to every word. I added that this same nurse had told my investigator something else. Victoria Sloan had been present in the delivery room, and she personally administered what she claimed was a routine medication just minutes before Emily went into cardiac arrest. Andrew asked weakly what investigator I was talking about. I confirmed that I had not been handling any of this alone. I told him I had hired a private investigator, and that I now possessed surveillance photographs, financial records, medical documentation, and testimony from multiple independent sources. I smiled, letting the weight of that sink in, and told them I also had something else they might find interesting. I walked to what used to be James's desk and opened the top drawer, removing a small digital recorder. I explained that the entire conversation had been recorded, every word they had spoken, every reaction, every admission. I held up the device and calmly reminded them that in Massachusetts, only one party needed to consent to recording a conversation. Since this was still technically my home, I qualified. Lauren jumped to her feet and insisted that it could not be used in court, fumbling for the correct legal term. I corrected her, explaining that it was not entrapment but evidence. Evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Evidence strong enough to send both of them to prison for a very long time. Andrew finally asked what I wanted. I laughed, and there was nothing warm or gentle in the sound. I told him I wanted my money back. I said I wanted the baby placed for a proper adoption with a family who would love him and tell him the truth about his birth mother. I said I wanted Victoria Sloan arrested for the serial killer she was. And I told them I wanted both of them to live the rest of their lives knowing they had tried to murder their own mother for money. Lauren asked whether cooperation would make a difference. I told her that if they cooperated fully, I would consider not pressing charges for attempted murder. The fraud charges, conspiracy charges, and accessory to murder charges were already beyond my control, but attempted murder was still my decision. I looked at them carefully. These were the same people who had shared my table, my holidays, my home. The same people who had planned my death with the same efficiency one might use to plan a vacation. I told them they had 24 hours to decide. They chose badly. Instead of confessing or cooperating, instead of showing even a trace of remorse, Andrew and Lauren doubled down on their original plan. I learned this at 6 o'clock the next morning when Daniel Reeves called Mrs. Lou's bed and breakfast with urgency in his voice. He said they were moving fast. He explained that he had been monitoring their communications, and that they had spent the entire night on the phone with Victoria Sloan, and another person they kept referring to as the cleaner. I asked what kind of cleaner he meant. He explained it was the kind who made problems disappear permanently. He told me they were planning to have me killed again, and this time they intended to make sure my body was found so there would be no doubt about my death. Mrs. Lou, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, immediately began making phone calls. Within 15 minutes, Peter Caldwell was at the front door with his pickup truck, and we were evacuating to a safe house Daniel had arranged. As we drove through the darkness just before dawn, I asked how much time we had. Daniel told me not much. The cleaner they hired was flying in from New York that very morning. According to his sources, the man specialized in murders disguised as accidents and had a perfect success rate. The safe house turned out to be a small cottage on a private island that could only be reached by boat. Peter knew the owner, another fisherman who owed him favors and asked no questions. We arrived just as the sun was rising over the Atlantic. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I said it felt insane that my own son had hired a professional killer to murder me. Peter replied that people did terrible things for money, but he added firmly that they were not going to let anyone get away with it. An hour later, Daniel arrived with even worse news. He said Victoria Sloan was not just running a murder for inheritance operation. She was part of a much larger network that had been targeting wealthy elderly people across New England for years. He spread photographs and documents across the table, and explained that he had identified at least 20 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years. Every victim had been wealthy, every family greedy, and every death ruled accidental or natural despite circumstances that should have triggered investigations. When I asked how they had been getting away with it for so long, Daniel answered quietly that they had people inside the system. And that was when I understood that this was no longer just about my survival. Medical examiners, police detectives, even probate judges were involved. This was no longer just a twisted family arrangement. It was organized crime aimed at a very specific group of people. Mrs. Lou, who had insisted on coming with us despite the risks, leaned closer to the photographs spread across the table. She studied them with sharp concentration before pointing at one image. She said she recognized the woman. She explained that she had seen her at the hospital where she volunteered, about 6 months earlier. The woman had been asking questions about elderly patients who rarely received visitors. She claimed to be from some kind of social services organization. Daniel and I exchanged a look immediately. She had been scouting, looking for potential victims. And now they were coming after me because I was the first person who had survived their operation and could testify about how it worked. Peter spoke next, his voice firm. He said we needed to make sure his testimony was recorded before anyone had the chance to silence him. I spent the rest of that morning writing everything down. Every detail of Andrew and Lauren's betrayal. Every document, photograph, and transaction connected to Victoria Sloan's operation. Every name, date, and amount I could remember. I wanted the truth preserved somewhere, even if something happened to me. Around noon, Daniel's phone rang, and the expression on his face changed the moment he ended the call. He said they had found the cleaner, dead in his hotel room. A single gunshot to the head. Professional execution. I asked what that meant. Daniel explained that Victoria Sloan was eliminating loose ends. Anyone who could connect her to the murder network was being removed, including potentially my son and daughter-in-law. The idea of Andrew being murdered should have horrified me. Instead, I felt a cold and unsettling sense of satisfaction. I said that perhaps it was time for them to understand what betrayal felt like. Peter shook his head and told me I did not understand the full danger yet. He said that if Sloan was cleaning house, that included me, but it also included the baby. An orphaned infant with no legal guardians was a liability she could not afford. My blood turned cold as the realization hit me fully. James Emily. She would have him killed too. It would be staged as a tragic accident. A carbon monoxide leak, a house fire, something that erased both the evidence and the witness. I stood up so abruptly that my coffee spilled across the table. I said we had to get him immediately. Peter warned that it was too dangerous. He said they would be watching my old house, waiting for me to appear. I answered that if that was the case, then I would give them exactly what they were waiting for. The plan was straightforward, which made it terrifying. I would surrender myself to Andrew and Lauren. I would let them believe they had one. And I would trust that Daniel and Peter would be positioned to rescue both me and baby James Emily when Victoria Sloan arrived to finish the job. Mrs. Liu said bluntly that it was the worst plan she had ever heard. I replied that it was also the only plan that saved an innocent child, and gave us enough evidence to dismantle Sloan's entire operation. As I checked the hidden recording devices Daniel had provided, he explained that he had been monitoring communications all morning. Victoria Sloan was driving up from New York and planned to arrive at my former house that evening. Andrew and Lauren had been instructed to have me there alive so Sloan could question me about what I knew before arranging my final accident. I told Peter that they believed I was going to trade my life for the baby. I added that they had no idea I had been planning this for days. The recording devices were already hidden throughout my former home, planted by Rachel Adams while Andrew and Lauren were away making arrangements with Sloan. Rachel had also positioned cameras in key locations and would be hiding in the basement with baby James Emily, prepared to escape through the old servant's entrance if anything went wrong. As we reached the dock in Gloucester, Peter asked one last time if I was sure. I told him that if I did not do this, an innocent baby would die because of my son's greed, and that was something I could not live with. I walked up to my former front door at exactly 6 o'clock. As planned, Andrew opened it. He looked exhausted, frightened, and older than I remembered. He said my name softly, and for just a moment, I heard the voice of the little boy I had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for. "Hello, Andrew. I'm here as promised." Lauren was pacing back and forth in the living room, her usual composure completely gone. She said that Victoria Sloan would be arriving soon, and that she wanted to speak with me. I replied that I was sure she did. Andrew tried to speak, started to say my name, then stopped. He said he never wanted things to go this far. I told him quietly that he had allowed it to happen. I said he let it reach this point because $3 billion mattered more to him than his own mother's life. He could not look at me. Victoria Sloan arrived exactly at 7 o'clock. She was smaller than I expected, neat and professionally dressed, the kind of woman who could easily pass for an accountant or a lawyer, which I assumed she was. She greeted me pleasantly, extending her hand as though we were meeting socially, and said she was glad I had survived the boating accident. She added that we had much to discuss. I agreed. She sat across from me in what used to be my own living room, opened a leather portfolio, and began speaking as though this were a business negotiation. She said I had caused serious trouble for her clients and pointed out that Andrew and Lauren had followed her instructions exactly, yet I was still alive and clearly informed about matters she claimed did not concern me. I said that murder concerned me, especially when it involved my own life. She explained that she preferred to think of her work as estate planning acceleration, helping families access inheritances that would otherwise remain tied up in lengthy probate processes. She smiled coldly and said it was a valuable service for people who understood that time was money. When I asked what service she provided to the elderly people she killed, she answered that she gave them peace, an end to confusion and fear associated with age-related cognitive decline, and what she described as a dignified death that allowed families to remember them as they once were. I stared at her, stunned by how easily she justified mass murder. I asked how many people she had killed. She glanced at her portfolio as if checking a schedule and said that over the past 5 years, she and her clients had successfully resolved 37 cases involving elderly individuals whose continued existence created financial and emotional hardship for their families. 37 murders. She spoke about them as casually as if she were discussing paperwork. I asked whether I was meant to be number 38. She corrected me and said I would be number 39, explaining that another matter had been resolved earlier that day involving a man who had become too curious about their operations. She added that I would need to have another accident, one that would be permanent. She then mentioned the baby, describing a tragic carbon monoxide leak, and noting that old houses often had dangerous heating systems. I looked at Andrew and Lauren, who sat frozen on the sofa, unmoving. I asked whether this was truly what they wanted, Not just my death but also the death of an innocent child. Neither of them answered. Sloane continued calmly, saying the baby was a loose end whose existence complicated inheritance arrangements and raised too many questions. She said it would be simpler to eliminate him and allow Andrew and Lauren to present themselves as tragically childless and deserving of sympathy and wealth. That was when I smiled for the first time since she arrived. I told Miss Sloane that there was something she needed to know. When she asked what it was, I told her she was under arrest. Federal agents entered at the same moment through every possible entrance, including the front door, the back door, the basement, and even the windows. They had recorded every word of Victoria Sloane's confession, including her admission to 37 murders and her plans to commit 2 more. Agent Olivia Park formally placed her under arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering. Sloane tried to run, heading for the kitchen as if hoping to reach the back door. She made it only 6 feet before agents tackled her onto the hardwood floor. Andrew and Lauren remained seated in shock as their rights were read to them. Agent Chan turned to me afterward and said that what I had done was extremely dangerous but very well executed. It was then revealed that Daniel Reeves was not merely a private investigator. He was a former Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who had been working undercover to dismantle the elder abuse network Victoria Sloane controlled. My situation had given them the opportunity they needed to capture her full confession on record. They had been tracking her for 2 years, but she had always been careful, using intermediaries and maintaining plausible deniability. That changed today, when she confessed openly to 37 murders and outlined plans for 2 more on federal recording equipment. Rachel Adams came up from the basement carrying baby James Emily, both unharmed. She asked whether it was finally over. I confirmed that it was, at least the dangerous part. The legal process lasted months. Andrew and Lauren were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, elder abuse, and accessory to murder in the death of Emily Hart. Andrew accepted a sentence of 25 years, and Lauren received 20 years. Victoria Sloane went to trial and was convicted on all counts. She received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over the next year, the network she had built collapsed piece by piece. 17 additional conspirators were arrested, including corrupt medical examiners, probate attorneys, and family members who had knowingly participated in the murders. Investigators ultimately uncovered more than $200 million stolen from elderly victims across 6 states. But the most important outcome was James Emily. With the full support of the courts and Emily Hart's extended family in Canada, I legally adopted him. They were deeply grateful that someone would raise Emily's son with honesty and love, and that he would grow up knowing the truth about the brave young woman who gave her life trying to give him a future. This child's name is James Emily Whitman, I told the family court judge. James for his grandfather. Emily for his birth mother. Whitman because this is the family that will protect him and tell him the truth. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had followed the case closely, smiled softly and said she believed Emily Hart would have been proud. I am 72 now, 5 years later, and James Emily has grown into a remarkable boy. He knows exactly who he is and where he came from. He knows his birth mother was a courageous teenager named Emily, who wanted him to have a better life. He knows his adoptive father and stepmother tried to use him as part of a scheme that cost Emily her life. And he understands a hard truth far beyond his years. Sometimes the people who should love you most are the very ones you must protect yourself from. Mrs. Liu still runs her bed and breakfast, though she now also advises elderly people who suspect their families may not have their best interests at heart. Peter Caldwell still operates his fishing charters, but around town he is something of a legend, the man who pulled a dead grandmother out of the Atlantic and changed everything. Daniel Reeves, Agent Reeves, remains with the FBI. Every Christmas he sends me a card with photos of other elderly people whose lives were saved, because one case finally exposed the truth. Andrew and Lauren remain in prison. Andrew still writes occasionally, filling his letters with explanations, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. He claims he was manipulated by people smarter than he was. I never reply, because what I learned during my week as a dead woman is this. Family is not blood, obligation, or inheritance. Family is who protects you, who shows up when it matters, and who chooses love over greed, every single day. James Emily and I have that kind of family now. One where no one is pushed off boats. One where no one steals trust funds. And one where no one has to die for someone else to get rich. It is far better than the family I was born into, and far better than the one I raised. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.